So tell me about your latest book.
That's a very large question. Can you give me a more specific place to start?
Well, I'd like to know what inspired it because when in fact, your publicist didn't send me a PDF of it yet, and I have to get that. But when I looked at it, it involved many different worlds, and that's what I thought
Hmm.
was fascinating about it. So what was the inspiration for what I would describe it as a very ambitious project?
Yeah, it kind of, gosh, it's a long story, man, if we really want
You
to
could
like
tell me, come on.
dig at it. So there were the original absolute kernel for it was actually, I can't remember the poet's name. The collection is called, I believe, Crystallography. It's a very obscure, I don't read a lot of poetry, and for some reason I landed on this book. And in the book, there's a poem that explores the idea that the reflections we see when we place mirrors in opposition to one another, about them being gateways into alternate universes, and continues with that imagery to the idea of having multiple mirrors reflecting, that effect where you get a tunnel of reflections that create the illusion of the mirror having depth. And that kind of launched this conceptual idea, which was a story that somehow involved that as a basis for some kind of a magic system or something like that. The idea of mirrors as gateways. And I've always been a fan of things like the Amber series, and multiverse, kind of concepts go back to my effectively to my childhood when I was in my prime fantasy reading years. So it lingered, and then it connected to, I was trying to I was working on a pilot, a script that had no other drive behind it other than I had worked on a pilot with the actor Ben Whishaw, and I really adored him and loved his work, and I wanted to write something for him. So I started just basically starting with a character, of in a certain situation that connected with Ben, and for me, I mean, not with him personally, because he never knew anything about any of this. And somehow that merged with the mirror thing. And I think the first scene that I ever wrote is not in the book, was this scene about this guy uh, having a, it was very hard noir kind of opening. And then in his apartment, he opens a door and he's got a room that has hundreds of mirrors arranged in a very specific maze. And he steps into a mirror at the heart of the maze. And then a moment later, a copy of him, but that has distinct styling differences, steps out of that mirror and then proceeds to smash all the mirrors in the room, and then gets caught in some kind of a trap. And it's all a big WTF kind of scenario. And then the pilot was going to, strand off from that. So I chased that idea for a long time, and then couldn't quite get it to square as TV. Tried three or four different approaches, stabs at it as a novel, where I couldn't seem to find, I had a good idea of what the world was, but I couldn't find the entry point. And then one day I was out for a bike ride, and my mind was just kind of looping places, starting points for stories. And, somewhere, some memory of my daughter growing up and her favorite toys and the smell of them. I told you this takes a while. Um, Connected with the idea of this of a kind of classic Gone Girl, and the mom having nothing left but the scent, and trying everything she can do to preserve the bedroom so that the scent of her daughter doesn't leach away. And I was thinking, I was like, well, I don't know where that goes, but I like that as a starting point of that character trying to do that. And then that starting point merged with this other thing. And gave it a focus, for the character Sid Catchpenny to be the person who is not really brought in to find the girl, but is brought in to help with an aspect of that, and then ends up trying to find the missing girl. So that's that part of it. Then I tell you, man, it's 10, 12 years of not constant. It's not one of those books where it's like, I labored on this thing it's just more that it was always there. And I had written a lot of material. I tried a few different approaches for it as a book, and I'd say each of those went 20 to 40,000 words before I bailed out. So I had done a lot of writing. And then as I went into it, I don't know, I just had this sense that at a certain point, I was like, I don't know how far in, and it was getting big. Conceptually, it was getting big. He's got this, Sid is a magical thief who's got this background where this history that he abandoned, where he might have been a rock star, and he's got a murdered wife in his background, and then he's got what's going on in the present day with the missing kid, and it was starting to feel big. And then at a certain point, I was like, I think I need to rein this in. And then I was like, yeah, no, opposite. I'm going to kitchen sink this sucker. And so a lot of ideas that I had that were kind of drifting around. There was an idea I developed trying to find where the story was about a group of middle-aged guys who've been playing the same Dungeons and Dragons campaign for 30 years. And that ended up coming in as an element in the story. I had written a straight up pure fantasy novel a few years back and never found a home for it. And when I got to the point in the story and I had this idea for a completely different book that I had started that involved the developer of a massively multiplayer online game. And when that character got pulled into this story, I then needed to flesh out the world of that game. And I ended up using elements from my abandoned fantasy novel to flesh out, what that game was. So it was kind of, in a way, all these things that I loved, that I'd been worked on and never found a home for, ended up finding a home in this book. And I just really, I've never gone completely more is more in any of my books. They're not like fine-tuned Swiss watch books by any means. Sloppiness is part of my process, but this one, I just chased it. I don't know, man. I haven't thought about it that much, to be honest.
Well, that's a good point, because a lot of writers you speak to, they always when they give you advice, they always say, try to make it as narrow as you can, because the more characters you're adding, the more complexity, and the more you get the chance that an editor is just going to call you up and say, I can't publish this, I'm getting confused. So it's interesting how you manage to go against the conventional wisdom with this.
Yeah, and to be perfectly honest, I can't even remember how long my first draft was, but it was long. And by the time I was sending it out, I had cut at least 50,000 words from that draft.
Wow.
And then by the time when my editor got it, he really liked it. But it was really, his primary note was, let's clear stuff away. So as overstuffed as it is now, there was more, there was more. There wasn't a character in this sucker that didn't have a backstory, and those were, I was constantly going down those channels when I got to some place. I was constantly exploring who is this person and how did they get, since there is world building and it involves this kind of, underground magical demimonde in Los Angeles, I was constantly veering off into how did this person become a part of this world? What was it in their life that gave them the imagination to accept that this could be a thing and then actually dive into it and have a need to be a part of this world. And all that stuff got cut away. And so it got zeroed in, but it's all relative from where it was. And I think I had there was, to be honestly, there was to me, a sense that I understand the prevailing wisdom of keep it specific, don't let it go too crazy. But I think that applies particularly more to the lane that I've tended to publish in, which is, much more traditional crime. I've written stuff that overlaps horror and science fiction, but it's still tended to be more categorically crime. I'm not really a mystery writer. There's not usually any kind of a traditional sense of my books being hit mysteries. This, because I felt like it's even less of a mystery and less of a crime story, and much more of a fantasy novel, and plays more in those tropes, I think. And that is a world where, particularly the world building aspects of working in fantasy, where I think breadth is appreciated and desired. If people like a world, they want to go in all the nooks and crannies. They really like getting all the little tiny minutiae and seeing the larger implications of whatever your core concept is as it rolls out. I'm speaking for myself, but I think that that's just generally true of people who are into that. So the balancing act for me was how to bring the world building across without it becoming burdensomely expository, and to continue to keep it focused on the characters and their journeys, because that's something I don't have a lot of patience for when I'm reading fantasy, and it's where I get bogged down in a lot of modern fantasy is the world building just takes over everything, and the story and the characters,
people are more entertaining than worlds, you feel. Always. It's, I'll hear about some book where I'm like, oh, that's a fascinating concept, I can't wait to explore that. And then I'm just like, so this character I'm exploring this world with is really just a narrator. That's their only role in this, is to explain the world to me. And then I usually get tired of that very quickly. Yeah, the world is rational, people are not.
I'll buy that. Yeah.
What would you say, when I was reading, is Skinner the correct pronunciation of your novel?
Of my previous novel? Yes.
Previous novel, yeah. So, there's an undercurrent of conspiracy in it. And this was a question I had when I remember rereading it, and I said to myself, wow, the conspiracies today are so much different from the conspiracies 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And do you think that it'll become something circular, or do you think that at the moment we live in, conspiracies will just, the new conspiracy will just be related to things like vaccines and other things that, like,
oh gosh,
20 years ago, you wrote that about 12 years ago, right?
About that sounds about right.
About 12 years ago. So, what do you think will be happening with when you term the world conspiracy, in the next 20 years from now?
It's not a like, conspiracy is not a place that my brain functions in, right? I tend to be a much more of a surface reader of events, and I don't think there's a whole lot of need to imagine conspiracies manipulating how we live our lives.
Yeah.
It's just the ways and means of power. It's just the ways and means of power. People who are in power and people who are drawn to power, they're always going to manipulate anything they can in their favor because that's part of their nature. Um, it doesn't, you don't need to look far below the hood if you accept that premise. I don't know. I think that it certainly doesn't appear that we're on a path towards clarity or where a place where people are going to like suddenly tire of conspiracies. It feels as though the world that we're in now and the path that we're on now is one in which deceit and manipulation become easier and easier to accomplish, which then makes it easier to spread conspiracy. It also makes it easier to perceive conspiracy where it doesn't exist, to earnestly think it's there without being somebody who's manufacturing it. Um, I don't know about like this. I can't even imagine I don't even know. I'm not up to date on what the current, vogue is I I dodge all that shit. The minute I feel like I'm in proximity to QAnon or anything vaguely resembling that, I'm immediately shy away from it. I'm just like, I don't want to go down that fucking hole. I don't want to think about the people who are indulging in this, let alone the people who manufacture it. I don't want to know what that nature is. I'm speaking specifically of something like QAnon, not necessarily conspiracies in general. Um, so I can't speak to it specifically, but I feel like I feel like the human condition that we may be steering toward is deeply informed by our how much we believe lies that are being told or conspiracies that are being, promulgated, and how deeply and immediately we're connected to those things at the same bandwidth and immediacy that we're connected to the truth. So that if I turn on the news, disastrous events across the country, real, authentic, have an immediacy now because the speed at which they're transmitted and the intensity at which they're transmitted that they didn't used to have. Even in my childhood, it would, at the very least, you'd be waiting for the evening news, before you heard about anything, happening outside your immediate realm. And part of the byproduct of that experience is that things that are at a great distance from us feel like a threat, and get perceived by a threat. I believe this, and increase our anxiety. And we perceive lies that we engage with, that are believable enough. We engage with them at the same level of intensity and have a similar reaction of anxiety. Or we have a reaction in anxiety because we're like, oh my God, there are people out there manipulating the truth like this and other people believing it. So I think that as we head deeper into an era of conspiracy and manufactured facts and all that stuff, that the net result for the human condition is to feel anxious and alienated. I don't, all these things are being communicated to me as if they're real and they're making me feel anxious. But similarly, I feel alienated from the world around me because I don't know what to believe.
So you think we're more scared people than we've ever been?
I think that's a much more succinct way to put what I just said.
Because I feel that too. I mean, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, there was a Cold War, and occasionally I was a real dork. So I would be reading Newsweek at the age of 9 or something. And I was afraid of that something would go wrong with the bomb, and but now I think even from COVID, and you read about a lot of shootings everywhere, and I think people now are more fearful than they've ever been. I mean,
Yeah,
I just, when I would ask my dad about it, he's like, "Oh, both blundering superpowers will find a way, so don't worry about it,
right.
son." But now it's just, everything feels like, that you could be 20 feet away from danger.
Yeah. And I think it's ironic that people who are in our generation, who were aware and alert during the Cold War, and I experienced I was a teenager through a lot of the Reagan years. So I experienced that, of course, with teenage fatalism and, oh, they're gonna blow the whole fucking thing up. It's gonna happen sooner or later. Um, but the idea that, I mean, nuclear holocaust is still the most immediate, practical global disaster, right? Like it can literally happen at any moment and wipe us all out, right? And it's something that somebody can actually physically do and make happen. And yet it doesn't feel like the largest slice of the doom pie anymore. Um, and I think that may be because it's not happened. and and also the sense that, well, that is something that we as human beings still have control over. Like that's the scary news is somebody can make it happen. The good news is we don't have to push that button. Whereas climate change is like, nope, done. Like we know that this slope is going down, and we're just trying to figure out how can we pump the brakes before we hit the bottom? Like how much can we ameliorate the situation? But we know it's going to be bad. We know bad things are on the horizon. Um, and that I think, for me personally, that sense of being a more scared person is that's the background radiation of it for me is climate, and then everything else is just our hot points
And then
within.
the viruses, I had COVID in December, and when I was sitting with a fever, unable to sleep at night, I'd only get 2 hours of sleep, and I said to myself, "Wow, talk about the how the world is so interconnected." This was,
Yes.
whatever a person thinks this might have been from a wet market in China, might have been from a lab. I don't know about this. And again, maybe going to conspiracies.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. But I just was looking, and I said to myself, you know, I tried to avoid this for almost 4 years. And there it is. And it's just this type of a feeling that, you know, how everything is just in a way interconnected, and how at that point there is this interconnected feeling of, no, I don't want to be connected to
Yeah.
this. you
Can I
know
unplug?
what?
Yeah. Can I
Yeah, can I
unplug? Can I get,
unplug
yeah.
from this? And I'm sitting with a fever, sick for like 2 weeks, like, wow, this was not fun.
Yeah, and I think that kind of interconnection and is like, if we're just specifically talking about COVID, is emblematic of just how deeply complex and global our world is at this point. That because of instantaneous transmission of massive amounts of information, because of the speed of travel, because we only have a global economy at this point. We have no independent national economies or local economies. It's all just one big thing. It is way too complex for anyone to really understand, well, if I yank these wires over here, what's the impact of that going to be? And I think it's one of the reasons why my sense of my sense of politics has become more and more local. whether we're talking about national elections or literal local elections, I tend to be far more focused on things that are about having the most immediate impact possible. Because beyond that, like, I don't know, and neither do you. Like this guy over here that's saying that they know what this is going to do around the world. You fucking don't. None of us do. You know, we have no idea what the implications are. And just all those conversations we were having in the first months of lockdown of what's this going to do? What's this going to mean? And it's just like, don't pretend. This is going to take years and years for the impact of this to shake out. We have no idea. Do you have kids?
No, I don't.
I have a 16-year-old. We have a 16-year-old daughter, you know, she was in junior high during lockdown and she weathered it really well. You know, she like in terms of the immediate emotional, mental, kind of physical impact of it, she stayed healthy. She didn't go into a deep depression, but she was absolutely traumatized by it, 100%. And developed patterns of behavior that we're only now able to kind of like perceive, oh, that really wasn't a thing before COVID. You know, the way she cocoons herself in her bedroom was not a pre-COVID thing, you know, and it's hard to separate, you know, was that just because she was entering her teen years and it's a really common thing? But no, it's not. And she talks about it. She's aware of it. And if any kind of like TV show or movie that is at all COVID adjacent, that acknowledges COVID with characters who are masked or anything like that, she's like, nope, will not watch it, wants nothing to do with anything like that, because it hurts her at this deep emotional level that in the moment while it was happening, she seemed to be very like, I got this, I'm cool, I'm all right. So I'm just like using that as this kind of like tiny personal anecdotal example of, we don't know, man, we don't know what's going on with these crazy choices that we're making right now in the world. And I don't see any sensible mental approach or state to exist in other than optimism, because to engage in any other state of mind about the future than optimism is just like to open the floodgates to, I'm going to get out of bed so I can crawl under my bed and I'll stay down there all day. Then I'll get back in my bed when it's time to go to bed.
Well, you know, it had a very, you know, when you look at and you're talking about your daughter and you realize like the time of childhood, the time of when you're a teen, it's all the experiences are very unique. It's like there's the 4 years, you know, from 13 to 18 and so on. And, you know, and people who are the age of you and I, like the years just kind of blend all together. So I can imagine how COVID was much more traumatic for very young people because you're only, you know, I would say I'm 48 and I felt the same that I felt 48 when I was 46 and I felt 46. It just it all blurs together. But even with that, I think that I don't think I'll ever be the same person since COVID. I tried to be very, very optimistic. I'd be making paste. I learned how to make chocolate eclairs. That was something skill that I had. And I kind of like emerged from COVID kind of like a shell when people would say, so Andrew, what have you done this past year? Well, you know, I know how to make good bread. And I learned how to make chocolate eclairs.
There you go, man.
And it wasn't as if, oh, I went and I saw Pompeii. It was, well, you know, you make the choux pastry over here. But anyway, yes, Sleepless. That to me is one of your most fascinating books. And how were you inspired by that? Do you ever have trouble sleeping like I do at times?
Yeah, I mean, not as much anymore. I used to have much worse, much larger problems sleeping. There was a book that I mentioned in the acknowledgments, I think I can't remember the author's name. I think it's called The Family That Couldn't Sleep.
Yeah.
And it was this nonfiction book about the actual disease, the actual prion disorder that causes this disease, the real disease that the book spins off from. And I was just kind of fascinated by that idea. I always liked learning about dreaming and sleep from very young. I remember Ursula K. Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven had a really big impact on me when I read it when I was very young. So there was that kind of fascination. And then, just I read the nonfiction book, and then I just started thinking about, that in the context of genre of, what if there was a plague? And then what happened is I was in the kind of framing stages of writing the book. I can't recall now if I had started really started on it. But somewhere in there, my wife was pregnant. And then about the time our daughter was due to be born, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer.
I'm sorry.
No, she's great. She's great.
Good.
She's great now. It's a long time ago now.
Good.
So when our daughter was born, my wife was undergoing chemo and all kinds of things were happening. So, and this was, in terms of timing, around the time I really needed to start getting serious about writing the book, when my daughter was a couple months old, and we were still my wife was still very much in chemo, and we were still very much in the part of having an infant when there's little or no sleep, and because of our specific circumstances, neither of us were really sleeping. And then, I had already framed the book so that I knew that Webb, the protagonist's wife, was going to be sleepless, was going to have the disease, and that they had a newborn. And I think I had framed that up before my wife was even pregnant. So a lot of that book ended up, you ask if I had trouble sleeping or whatever, I would say not as a lifelong, but there was a lot of work that was being done on that book during, a period of time where I was seriously sleep deprived, living with a lot of fear. And, it really bleeds into the book itself. It was hard for me to imagine. It was hard. I think that I was so out of sync. And that was also around 2008, which relative to now doesn't feel that scary. At the time, 2007 into 2008, with the financial collapse, with our presidential elections at that time, we were still, deep in war. That was a super scary, now it feels like, can we go back to 2008?
I know, isn't it odd? Yeah.
It was hard for me to imagine how a human being would actually function in a world where this slow motion apocalypse was speeding up, which is why the book, is very dark, and why ultimately Webb can't live in that world. Is not. I've got the wrong Park. I've got the wrong protagonist. Why he can't live in that world is, I think, ultimately because I couldn't imagine an outcome where he figured things out, saved the day, and was able to protect his wife and daughter just didn't seem feasible. I can remember trying to kind of find what that book's version of a happy ending was. Yeah, it was a dark time. It was a dark time working on that one. Yeah.
It had like some bit of, it had like Raymond Chandler meets Philip K. Dick, I felt to it. There's like this.
I'll take that 100%.
There's like a noir, but also with a very good idea to it, and that's what I find very effective about your works is that, you probably, except for the first book, you probably need like 6 words to describe many of your novels, and that to me that's always very, very effective as an editor, because if you can describe a novel concept within 1 sentence, you have the reader, and it just comes down to becoming a professional. Would you say that you have that quality in your works because you're also into the comic book world of comics that, forces you to be succinct, forces you to get to the point?
No, like the comic books came after the novels for me. I wrote a few novels before I ever got approached about comic books, and it's not really, that was a couple of years that I did that. No, it's just taste, really what it is it's just taste and a certain amount of storytelling instinct of a feeling of when I pick up a book to read, I want things to be happening. If I pick up a book and there's a long description of landscape is the first thing, it is highly unlikely I'm going to continue, If I pick up a book and I'm getting backstory about a character right away, it's highly unlikely I'm going to continue. I like to read stories where I'm with characters where they are now. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're in the middle of a car chase, It could be a picnic. But I like to experience a story where things are happening immediately, a sense of immediacy to them. And so that translates into my writing, that I like to be moving right away and be in the middle of a situation right away. And I think that I have a good sense of when events start to flag. When I'm writing, I can feel it. I can feel it where I'm like, this is saggy now. Something needs to happen. And sometimes I'll write my way through that and I'll say, well, that's true, but I know it's sagging here, so I'm going to finish up whatever this is, and then I'll figure out what's going to be cut or moved around, and then something else is going to have to be spliced in there. And it could be a change, just a point of view change. It doesn't have to be somebody pulling a gun. It can be somebody asking an unexpected question. It can be recognizing there's an opportunity to cut out of a scene earlier than I thought I could. It's like, oh, right, the reason this is sagging is because the scene is just too fucking long. So I'm just going to end it here, and then I'll pick it up, wherever it needs to be picked up. But yeah, I think it's less about, because like, for instance, I think my work as a novelist is the primary place I come from when I go to other media. So it's not a thing where my work in another media makes me leaner as a novelist. The opposite is actually true. My work as a novelist makes me bloated in TV or comic books. I overwrite. When I did write comic books, I was constantly having to scale back my dialogue because dialogue obviously is visual in comic books, and it covers up the fucking pictures, So I was constantly going, right, I need my bubbles. I need fewer bubbles and smaller bubbles, because I'd have these pages that would just be all white and two heads, and nobody wants to look at that. And it's similar when I'm writing for TV and for film. My first drafts are always way too long, and I'm constantly having to cut, and the majority of the cutting that I do is dialogue, to try and lean things up. Because when you're writing a book, there is no horizon. There is no, like, it is just open forever. I'm not working in a world as a writer where people are waiting breathlessly for me to, hit a deadline. I start a book and I've got as much time as I want. And so I write expansively and indulge myself and see where I end up, and then start trying to fix things. And in other media, it doesn't, you can't get away with that. So, yeah.
What were you doing before you became a writer?
I was mostly bartending and waiting tables. I meandered around college for a long time, and the things that I loved were acting and writing. And I willfully did not pursue those things because I thought they were pipe dreams. I had nothing to model. My mom's a school teacher. My dad drove a forklift, taught school, and then eventually had a motorsport garage, the business that he started for himself. So he grew up in the North Bay suburbs outside of, like an hour outside of San Francisco. There was no path to being a writer or being an actor. So that meant I ended up ping-ponging around college, trying to figure out teaching credential, masters, and then try to teach in college, like those things. But in the 11th hour, I met people that were going to grad school for acting. And I was like, well, that's something I can do. So I went out of grad school, I moved to New York to be an actor, failed at that. Did all the things that you do when you're, an actor or any kind of an aspiring, artist, creative in New York. Wait tables, 10 bar, a couple other odds and ends, but really that was it. I mean, specifically when I wrote my first book, Caught Stealing, I was a bartender. I was exactly like, if you take out the guns and the chasing and the fighting and all of that stuff in Caught Stealing, and you just look at the day-to-day minutia of that character's life, that was just me, downtown bartender, drinking too much, not directionless in his life, when some years later, when the book found an agent, I was very much doing the same thing. I was in a different place, but I was in Midtown, but I was still, bartending. And that was really, it took a few years of start and stop. I can remember getting the advance for the first two books and writing, writing the second book while living off the very modestly off the advance. My wife was working, and then coming to the end of that, and the first book hadn't published. And so I was like, there's still months and months from the first book being published, and there was no real sense that, well, they're not going to, before the first book even publishes, they're not going to want to buy another book from me, and having to go back out and start tending bar again. It took a few years, before the writing was able to carry me. And then, like most writers, I've actually had by any reasonable standard, a tremendously successful career as a writer, in that for going on probably about 18 years, I've been able to support myself as a writer. but if you look at a diagram of what that looks like financially, it's, there's the part where we're broke. Okay, we're going into debt. We're going into debt. We're going into, oh, we're back even again. Oh, look, we're up there. Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy. But that's, to be able to kind of scrabble together any kind of a living as any kind of an artist in particularly in this society where it's just has zero value, as far as there's no support for the arts whatsoever. There's no financial support for the arts, and very little cultural support for the arts. And I'm giving myself a lot of slack by using the word art
I
connected
would.
to.
I would. Your books are great. Who are some of the writers who inspired you to become a writer?
To become a writer? Oh, I mean, it's easier for me to talk about the kind of stuff I was reading when, like, I was reading everything you would expect that I was reading at the time I decided to try and write what I thought was going to be a noirish short story and then grew into a book. And I was reading Chandler, I was reading Hammett, I was reading a little bit of Elmore Leonard, a lot of James Ellroy. Oh gosh, who wrote the Friends of Eddie Coyle?
George V. Higgins.
Thank you, George V.
He's a great
Higgins.
writer.
Yeah, I mean, all those guys, I mean, and specifically the guys, were real influences. And then, and then other writers that increasingly played a role in my prose who I loved at the same time. William Gibson is obviously hugely influential with Sleepless and Skinner both, particularly Skinner. Like Skinner, in some ways, Skinner was a way for me to get the Gibson off my back. Joan Didion, oh gosh, Don DeLillo.
Have you read The Names?
Oh yes, oh yeah, yeah.
That's one of my favorite books. I lived in Greece in the 80s, and it was set over there, so it really struck a chord with me. That's a fantastic book.
I love him, and a lot of what I read was completely informed by what was really cheap at the used bookstores in Manhattan, because I didn't have any money. So if I had 2 or 3 books that were all about the same, and I was interested in all 3 of them, I would buy on page count. I would buy the thickest book, and so that I would get the most book for my back. And the book tables, I don't know if they still have them, like around Astor Square and stuff, those guys that would sell trade paperbacks below cover price, that I still don't know where they got them. That's probably where I picked up my first DeLillo, was off of one of those things. But that was an indulgence, because those were still like $7-8 a pop, and I was like, oof. I'd sit there with a 10 spot in my pocket and go over every single book on the table, trying to find the exact, because there could be no fails. I couldn't afford to buy a book and not really like it. Because I was going to have to read the whole damn thing. I couldn't afford not to read the whole damn thing. Yeah. I always struggle with influences. Like I'd really have to. Graham Greene's, detective fiction, but even his non-detective fiction. I don't know, all the usual suspects.
Well, before I let you go, you mentioned Elmer Leonard. I'll tell you a quick Elmer Leonard story. He used to live about 15 minutes away from me, and I got to know him. I interviewed him, so I would stop by every now and then, and I'd bring French pastries. And he was a very down-to-earth guy. He had like a little penknife in his pocket, and there'd be a chocolate eclair. He would cut the eclair in half with his penknife.
Yeah.
Wipe off the creme patisserie with his handkerchief, put it back in his pocket. And he was such an easy, down to earth, easygoing guy that his housekeeper is there cleaning. He's like, "Oh, come and have some tea and chocolate eclairs with us." So he was a very, very nice man.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
I like to hear it.
Well,
I
are
love
you?
that chocolate eclairs figure so prominently in your life.
Yeah. Hey, I think you really you got something over there. But I was getting a couple of years ago. I was getting migraines, so ocular migraines, the ones where you get like that, that white spot in your eye and it starts expanding, and then you end up getting this firework thing.
Oh
Have you
gosh.
ever had that?
No, I have not,
You can
thankfully.
put that in your new novel, but
Okay.
it was always you wouldn't get like the pain in your head. You just would get the aura for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then
Oh my gosh.
I spoke to my doctor, and he's like, "Look, stay away from processed foods, chocolate. These things have this thing that these triggers that could trigger a migraine."
Right.
So yeah, when I first had it, I was like, "Oh my God, am I having a stroke?" And then
Yeah.
thank God for Dr. Google that they said, "Well, this is the type of thing that'll go away in 5 minutes." But so knock on wood, I haven't had one. It'll be 2 years in May.
Good.
But whenever I've had it, I've done something stupid like have a hot dog or or very poor quality chocolate. So, but yeah, are you gonna do a book tour, Charlie?
They don't really do that anymore, do they? I
Hardly.
mean, yeah, it's like they don't really put you out on the road the way they used to. I think we'll do, I'm in Southern California. We'll do a couple local things around here, but I don't have the time or the wherewithal to put myself out on the road. So I'll just do a couple local things and that'll be it.
I heard Vromans is selling the place.
I just saw it. I just saw
Yeah,
it, and that's my local. I mean, that's where I
yeah.
can it's a few miles away, but I can ride my bike there. I'm there at least once a month. Yeah, I'm glad that they're saying they're not going to sell to a chain. I just hope they can find any buyer. That's what crushes me is, will anybody want to buy those stores? I
Well,
mean,
Barnes and Noble is opening 53 bookstores this year,
no
and
kidding.
and I'm seeing even in our area, bookstores are just popping up and they're independents and they're busy.
Yeah,
And I kind of think that this is kind of a reaction to people who are just tired of just looking at their phones all day. I mean,
yeah,
there's a bookstore in a quite a nice little downtown area, and they're doing very, very, very well over there. It's not a big bookstore by any
yeah,
means, but they're doing well. And you'll go in there on a Saturday and there are probably 10, 15 people in there, and
right.
it's surprising, and I'm very, very surprised, but I'm happy about it. So
Of course.
I think that the bookstores are seeing a resurgence. I think COVID has maybe made people, and this is not the best thing to say, but I think it's made people a little more insular in some respects.
So, I mean, that
You
may be
know,
part of it. Yeah,
yeah,
that
they're
may
like,
be
well,
part
I
of it.
can without people, I can without going to the bar, you know.
But I need
But
a couple books to get through.
I need a couple of books to get through it. Well, Charlie, so great talking to you. It was
Sure.
one of the most interesting conversations I've had. It was great to chat with you.
All right, take care, Andrew. We'll see you around.
Take care, Charlie. Bye bye.
Bye.